Ancient Truths TV. Unsealing the Scrolls. Declaring the Times.
Moses was saved from death by his own wife, and you've probably never heard this full story. A woman named Zeporah, a foreigner, invisible to many Bible readers, was solely responsible for stopping God from taking Moses' life on the way to Egypt. And yes, the Bible says this outright. In this video, you'll understand how Zeporah came into Moses' life, how she became his wife, and most impressively, how one simple act done by her stopped God's wrath and kept alive the man who would deliver Israel. What really happened on that journey? Why did God almost kill Moses? And what did Zeporah do with her own hands that changed everything? Zeporah's story in the Bible begins in an unexpected setting, not in Jerusalem nor in Egypt, but in the desert of Midian, where God was silently preparing the backstage for Israel's deliverance. There, in a land forgotten by kings and strategists, one encounter changes everything. Moses, a fugitive with no homeland and no purpose, arrives at a well where the daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, are being mistreated by shepherds. He doesn't hesitate. He acts, protects, intervenes. This seemingly simple gesture connects him directly to a woman who would change his life, Zeporah, Jethro's daughter. Exodus 2:16-21 reveals this crucial moment. Jethro, recognizing the courage and integrity of this foreign man, welcomes him into his home. And more than that, he gives Zeporah to him in marriage, sealing a union that was not only cultural, but deeply prophetic. The marriage between Moses and Zeporah is no accidental detail in the narrative. It is a key piece in the mysteries of the Old Testament. God was using a Midianite woman, a foreign wife in the Bible, to become the link between Moses' past as an Egyptian prince and his future as a prophet and deliverer. Who was Zeporah? A woman of quiet courage, but strategic presence. She doesn't appear with lengthy speeches, but her entry into the story is decisive. She appears at the moment Moses most needed welcome, a new beginning, a human covenant that would precede his covenant with God. From the moment she becomes Moses' wife, her path becomes intertwined with one of the Bible's most powerful stories. This marriage, unlikely in the eyes of tradition, but fully aligned with God's sovereign plan, is only the beginning of a much greater plot. What happens next reveals that Zeporah's role, far from passive, would be crucial not only to preserve her husband's life, but to ensure the fulfillment of a divine mission. The story of Moses and Zeporah was just beginning. The marriage between Moses and Zeporah carries a depth that goes beyond the simple cultural gesture of acceptance. When Moses chooses to unite with a foreign woman, a Midianite, he is, unknowingly, foreshadowing the kind of obedience that God would later demand, a faithfulness that transcends customs, judgments, and human traditions. It is here that Zeporah's story begins to take on even more meaningful contours, not just as Moses' wife, but as an active part of the spiritual and emotional formation of Israel's deliverer. The name Zeporah, which means bird or sparrow, holds strong symbolism. Birds are creatures that fly high, free, but also know how to build nests in the most unlikely places. And that is exactly what she did. She built a home with Moses in the middle of the desert, a place where he was healed from guilt, shaped by simplicity, and prepared for the day he would hear the voice of God from the burning bush. Zeporah was not just a wife, she was the environment God used to restore Moses. Their relationship is a symbolic expression of divine care behind the scenes of the mission. Exodus 2:22 presents us with the birth of their first son, Gershom, whose name means a stranger there. The name, chosen by Moses, reflects his feeling of displacement and a crisis of identity. But it also reveals something profound. Even far from his people, in a land that was not his own, Moses was being refined. And Zeporah, as his wife, was at his side, bringing forth life, building a family, supporting a man whom even she did not yet know, would become one of the most important figures in human history. During the years Moses spent in Midian, he was not just a shepherd, he was a man being emptied of himself. And in that process, Zeporah was both witness and support. Moses' life before Egypt is often overlooked, but it was in that silence that God prepared him to confront Pharaohs. And it is in that same silence that Zeporah's presence in the Bible reveals its strength. Steady, patient, indispensable. The wife of Moses was a Midianite in a narrative that until then seemed restricted to the Hebrew people. But God was already showing that his plan would not be limited to one ethnicity, one culture, or one territory. By uniting Moses with Zeporah, he was planting a seed of inclusion, foreshadowing what would come with the Messiah, grace that reaches beyond human boundaries. After years living in Midian as a shepherd and family man, Moses receives the calling that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. The burning bush scene is the turning point. God commissions him to return to Egypt and deliver the Hebrews from slavery. And when Exodus 4:20 records that Moses placed his wife Zeporah and his sons on a donkey to set out for Egypt, it is clear that he not only accepted the divine mission, but chose to take with him everything he had built in Midian. Zeporah, Moses' wife, did not stay behind. She would walk with him toward the center of God's will, even if it meant facing spiritual dangers of eternal proportions. But it is in the midst of that journey, between the calling and full obedience, that one of the most mysterious and theologically dense episodes of the Old Testament occurs. Exodus 4:24-26 shows us something almost unbelievable. And it came to pass by the way in the inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. That's right, God wanted to kill Moses. The same man who had been called to deliver Israel was now at risk of death by the hand of God himself. The spiritual tension is palpable, but the reason is subtly yet deeply revealed. Moses' son had not been circumcised. This was a direct breach of Abraham's covenant, as instituted in Genesis 17:10-14, where God declares that every Israelite boy must be circumcised on the 8th day as a sign of the everlasting covenant. Moses, for some reason, perhaps carelessness, fear, or even cultural pressure from being married to a Midianite woman, disobeyed God on this crucial point, and this error would not be tolerated even by a prophet. Biblical circumcision was not just a ritual, it was a sacred symbol of the chosen people's identity. In this critical moment, Zeporah's presence becomes even more significant. She was not a bystander, she was part of the mission. And when silence turns into threat, it is her action that prepares the way for what comes next. This story of Zeporah is about to become one of the most surprising among the women of the Bible. With Moses' fate hanging by a thread, the action of Moses' wife will make all the difference. What happens in Exodus 4:25-26 is, without a doubt, one of the most intense, enigmatic, and theologically rich moments in Moses' life. After the revelation that God wanted to kill Moses, it is Zeporah, the woman who seemed to be merely accompanying her husband on his mission, who takes center stage. With a swift and radical decision, Zeporah circumcises their son with a sharp stone. The Bible records, "Then Zeporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, 'Surely a bloody husband art thou to me.'" Exodus 4:25. This act seems brutal, and indeed it was not gentle, but it was full of meaning. Zeporah saves Moses with an act that symbolized the restoration of covenant. The blood of the circumcision was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was the blood of the covenant, once again sealing the commitment between man and the God of Abraham. In that moment, a foreign woman, who by birth was not part of the people of promise, showed more obedience to the law than the very man chosen by God to deliver a nation. Moses disobeyed God, but Zeporah, though a foreign wife in the Bible, had enough discernment to act in the spirit of the covenant. Her declaration, "a bloody husband," carries pain, indignation, and, at the same time, understanding. She understood that the price of covenant with God is blood. And more than that, she understood that for Moses to remain alive, she had to act with spiritual precision. There was no time for theological debates, nor for cultural excuses. The error had to be corrected, and Zipporah did it with the strength of a woman who grasped the seriousness of the things of heaven. This places her not just as Moses' wife, but as an instrument of God's mercy. God's wrath in this context is not cruelty, but justice. Moses himself, the one who would speak face to face with the Most High, was under judgment. And who saves him? Not Aaron, not an angel, not a miracle, but Zipporah, with a stone in her hand and reverence in her heart. This act reveals her courage, her readiness, and above all, her fear of the God of Israel. In just a few verses, she becomes one of the brave women of the Bible, saving one of the greatest prophets in history with an action few would dare to take. This episode not only exposes Moses' failure, but exalts Zipporah's discernment in the Bible. Among the many lesser-known characters of the Bible, she stands out for a reason few would expect. Her silent obedience saved God's chosen one from destruction. After the defining events that marked the journey to Egypt and the spiritual confrontation that nearly cost Moses his life, Zipporah's narrative in the Bible falls silent. The text does not directly state when or why Zipporah and the children were separated from Moses, but it is evident that at some point during the mission in Egypt, she was sent back to her father Jethro's house. Perhaps to protect them from the looming conflict with Pharaoh, or perhaps by divine instruction. The fact is that Moses' wife temporarily returned to the land of Midian with their sons. But this silence does not mean absence. On the contrary, in Exodus 18 we see Jethro and Moses reunited after the deliverance of the people of Israel, and with him returned Zipporah, Gershom, and Eleazar. Here, for the first time, we learn the name of Moses' second son, Eleazar, which means "my God is help." This detail is precious. The name reveals the acknowledgement that God was present in the most difficult moments, including the episode when Moses nearly died, and it was Zipporah who saved him. The family's return to the scene is not just an emotional footnote. It is a reaffirmation that, even away from the spotlight, Zipporah and Moses' children were part of the plan. They return not only as relatives, but as witnesses to the miracle that began at the burning bush and continued through the parting of the Red Sea. In this reunion, there are no lengthy speeches attributed to Zipporah, but her presence says much. She is the bridge between Moses, the Midianite shepherd, and Moses, the leader of Israel. Moses and Zipporah reunite not only as husband and wife, but as two essential parts of a story written by God himself. What makes Zipporah so unique among the lesser-known characters of the Bible is that her importance does not lie in the words she spoke, but in the decisions she made. Even as a foreign woman without Hebrew lineage, she understood and honored the covenant with God with a depth that at that moment not even Moses himself demonstrated. Her readiness to act, her quiet courage, and her reverence for the sacred make her a rare example among the women of the Bible. She not only saved Moses from God's wrath, but with her own hands preserved the continuity of a mission that would bring redemption to an entire nation. Zipporah and her obedience to God remind us that sometimes those who sustain the prophets are not the ones who preach loudly, but the ones who discern in silence and obey with reverence. If this story impacted you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep discovering biblical truths that almost no one talks about. Here, everything is done freely with the support of generous people around the world like you. Become a member or share this video to reach even more lives.